The title of my talk is The Romance of the Indian Space Program. This happens when you've been single almost all your life. You talk about romance of other things and another people. So what exactly do I mean when I say romance? A romance is something which is mysterious, which has an inherent element of some remoteness to life. Now, having said that, now I'm going to take you to a little treasure trove, let me take you to a historical timeline of how space age came to be. In 1957, Sputnik 1, the first satellite, was launched. That was the beginning of the space age in human civilization. And there was this one man who understood science the way science should be understood. His name was Jawaharlal Nehru. And because of whom, and he was so inspired by this satellite launch, that in 1958, he came up with something called the Science Policy Resolution of 1958. And that was responsible for funding basic research. That was responsible for getting research infrastructure in India. And there was no ambiguity of purpose, so to speak, between the scientists and the politicians there. In 1961 or so, there was this very interesting man called Vikram Sarabhai. He went to Nehru and he says, let's have a space program. And do you know how it started? It started with a conversation between Nehru and Bhabha and Sarabhai, where Sarabhai went to Nehru and said, see, we need a space program. And Nehru, of course, because we just got independence, he asked, why do we need a space program? He said, Nehruji, this is the prime reason that we need a space program, because one, we just got independence, and two, our country is very new. We don't know how big our country is. If we send a probe up in the space, and when we can look on how big our country is, we can reach out to people. We can identify their problems, and then by doing so, we can solve them. And after that discussion in 1961, it was decided that India is going to have a space program, and the world laughed at us because India is a poor country, and to which Sarabhai said, that's the primary reason we need a space program, because India is a poor country. So in 1962, Sarabhai met Jacques Blamont in Washington. This was the meeting in Washington called the COSPA. And in that, these two interesting gentlemen decided that France is going to help India build a space program. Jacques Blamont used to be the director of the French Space Agency at that time. So Department of Atomic Energy in 1962 identified 1 square mile area around Trivandrum. It was a charming tropical suburb to a non-existent town called Thumba. And the only constructed site in that 1 square mile area was a church. It was St. Mary Magdalene Church. And here's where romance begins. Everyone was so consumed in the idea of making India a scientific nation that all kind of divisions dissolved, and there was nothing as such which could divide them. So the St. Mary Magdalene Church, the church was made the workshop of the space agency, and Bishop's house used to be their office. Now, look at this. There was no institutional framework for a space program. And at that time, Yashpal told me so many years ago, they had no idea whatsoever what space technology is. And they were doing it. And of course, there was no support, and they were just learning on the go. The only way that they could learn was to give this launch site to people to launch their own rockets, and by doing so, learn from them. An interesting fact I'll tell you, there was an Ats 75 rocket called the Rohini 75 rocket, which was made from an aluminium tube bought from the local market of 75 mm. And if you remember, there is a very famous bullock cart image of Apple, where Apple was being transported outside to check telemetry. And that was done for 150 rupees at that time. And the entire telemetry would have costed India so much because the budgets were very small. And there's another thing which is very interesting about the space program. on the romance of space program, that all the people who were involved in the space program were only concerned about the space program. Kalam once wrote that to become the part of INCOSPA was the predecessor of ISRO. To become part of INCOSPA, the only qualification that these people had, including Chitnis and Brahm Prakash and Kalam and everybody, was Sarabhai's faith in them. Nobody looked at any degrees. They were not identifying people who were from great illustrious institutions. They were only looking at people who were dedicated to do work. And the image that we saw previously of Dr. Ramon with Sarabhai. So this guy, so they were trying to make a payload in India. Payload is something, it's an instrument which is used for observation. So they were trying to make an electronics payload in India. They were not able to do so because that time the technology was not such. We lacked some skilled people. So Brahman came for rescue. He said, let's do a sodium vapor test. Let's send a sounding rocket up in space, do a sodium vapor test, and look at the atmospheric physics of it. And because it's a sodium vapor payload, you don't need any electronics. And interestingly, Brahman got this fabricated in France. He got it from France. He actually brought it, putting on his lap. So he took a flight from France to Bombay, and from Bombay in a bus he went to Tumba. And these two gentlemen were trying to work that out. It was 20th of November 1963, this image. On 19 November midnight, Brahman walks out. He sees this young engineer trying to fit this French instrument in an American rocket. He was just filing the piece of that particular rocket to fit this thing in. And this young engineer eventually ended up becoming the president of India. He was APJ Abdul Kalam. So this one is another very interesting, I call it a very romantic image. From left you have Dhawan, who's called the architect of the space program. This is from the Space Commission, when the Space Commission meeting which was held, and it was decided that government will take over it. So it started as a private enterprise. So then you see Dhawan, then you see Kalam, then you see Manmohan Singh. Kalam was the project director then. Dhawan was the chairman of ISRO. And this guy was handling finances, Manmohan Singh. Then you have MGK Man, who was director of the TIFR. He was also the chairperson of DAE. So these two gentlemen in the center, the one became president of India, the other became prime minister of India. This is what Indian space program gave us. Then in 1966, a very sad thing happened. India was suffering, there was a great drought that time. And Sarabhai was a very empathetic man. And he wanted to solve this problem. The only way to solve this problem, and as both these gentlemen, I mean three of these men realized, it was Bhabha, Nehru and Sarabhai, that science is the answer to every problem in a developing country like India. And Sarabhai was really moved by the fact that satellites can be used for television broadcasts. It was just done during the Japan Olympics in the late 50s. So he decided, let's put televisions out there. Let's try and teach people how to do agriculture. Let's try and teach people how to save their crops. And that was when one thing which I hated all my life, every Sunday morning there was this show called Krishi Darshan. And that was started in 1967 to save India from drought. And that was Vikram Sarabhai's brainchild. And there's another very interesting story about Indian space program. I think most of you would be knowing about this person called M.S. Swaminathan, the father of Green Revolution in India. So this guy was handling this. So there was this coconut disease which happened in Kerala, and coconut being the major product in Kerala, because it was, the crop got hampered and people were suffering. And when you go on ground, wherever you go, you're not able to identify anything. because it's everywhere. You don't find the end of it. So MS Swaminathan goes to Vikram Sarabhai and says, see, I need a space image of this particular patch because I'm not able to identify to what extent do we have that disease. And Sarabhai's response was this, we don't have a Earth observation program, we don't do remote sensing. But what I'll do is I'll get an image from NASA. So long story short, they got the image from NASA, they were able to mitigate the disease. And that's when both of these gentlemen realized that we need an Earth observation program. And that was the beginning of the Indian remote sensing program. And imagine this. An agricultural scientist inspiring cosmic ray physicist to do space technology of which both of them have no idea. Well, I find it very romantic. Like really, really romantic. You don't have any idea. You're going somewhere and something is happening. Some things are failing, some things are not working, but it's just going on. And this is an image from the SITE program, the Satellite Instructional Television Experiment program. This was done in 1975. And Sarabhai, being Sarabhai, was adamant into giving television sets to the country. So Yashpal tells me that he and Yashpal were having this conversation, and Sarabhai told Yashpal that the only way to connect this country is to connect them via television. And Yashpal says, 1, there are no televisions. 2, there's no satellite. 3, there are no receivers. Are you thinking? Are you gone out of your mind? He said, no, we'll make. He said, I don't have a problem. Why don't you go and talk to the Prime Minister? And this guy walks into Mrs. Gandhi's office and says, we need to have satellite television done and we need to start education using the satellites. And that's exactly what Mrs. Gandhi says. He said, where are your rockets? There are no rockets. He said, I have friends, I have scientific friends in America and so on. So this man Sarabhai was able to persuade Americans on the far right. This image that you see is of the NASA's ATS-6 satellite, which was brought closer to the Indian peninsula for us to record broadcasts here and record television programs here and do broadcasts using this satellite. And on your left, you see these boxes being made. These were made in the Space Application Center in Ahmedabad. The first generation television that were made in India, for India. And the very famous phrase that India lives in its villages comes from the meeting where Sarabhai says, I'm not going to give any television to the metropolitan. India lives in its villages. So all these televisions were sent to panchayats and blogs. And that is where the first generation science communication, the public education started. And eventually, Sarabhai died. And MGK Menon was asked to take over. It was abrupt. And MGK Menon told Mrs. Gandhi that I can't take over, I already have things. And why don't you ask Dhawan? And this is what she said, and I quote, he doesn't listen to me. He's not answering my calls. And then MGK Menon, Huckster persuaded Dhawan, and he was brought in and made the chairman. And look at this very interesting phenomena here. Scientists and politicians dreaming together to make this country a scientific nation, which was really unheard of in a developing country. And we were very young and there was a lot of colonial hangover. And then Aryabhat was launched in 1975. That was our mark in the space age. And somebody told me that when it was entering the orbit, this guy had this shield running in his mind. It says, it was so weightless, the piece was so weightless that I was reciting Need again and again. Yun uthhe aap us gali se hum, jaise koi jahan se uthta hai. And eventually, when the first Indian cosmonaut entered the orbit, India India was as silent as sunshine. All of us was looking at the television. This one man from this small cockpit, barely, the broadcast was barely clear. The only person who you were able to see clearly was Mrs. Gandhi. And when Mrs. Gandhi asks this man, how does India look from above? And without blink of an eye says, Sare jahan se acha hai dostan hamara. Thank you.